History is rarely a static sequence of events, but within this specific geography and the 30-day window of April 1966, we can isolate the exact moments a society reconfigures itself. The post-war consensus was suddenly interrupted by these localized, intense bursts of modern activity. This month functioned as a threshold. On one side, the lingering conservatism of the 1950s, on the other, the onset of a cultural revolution. To track this shift, we look at three concurrent data streams: geopolitical alignment, economic policy, and cultural consumption. Examining these layers together allows us to see how a national identity actually recalibrates in real time. The streetscapes of the mid-1960s reflected an environment built on decades of traditional stability. But in Canberra, Prime Minister Harold Holt was actively accelerating Australia's commitment to the conflict in Vietnam. The administration relied on a new national service conscription system, determining a young man's eligibility for combat through a birthday ballot drawn from a lottery barrel. This policy drew a sharp domestic response, manifesting as visible public mourning and organized anti-conscription protests. By April 1966, the first conscripts, the Nashos, were in final preparations for overseas deployment. New Zealand Prime Minister Keith Holyoake adopted a similar, if more cautious stance, aligning his military with the same regional directives. For over half a century, the primary diplomatic and military ties anchored the region directly to the United Kingdom. These established connections were now detaching, sweeping across the Pacific to anchor instead to the United States. The commitment of troops to Vietnam effectively decoupled the region from its British imperial framework in favor of a new Pacific alliance. While military strategy redrew the global map, a parallel transition was happening within domestic household economics. Everyday citizens were rapidly trading in their heavy, ornate imperial coins for a newly implemented and much more streamlined decimal currency system. The transition caused immediate friction at store counters, as shoppers were forced to mentally recalculate the cost of daily goods. Public compliance was driven by an aggressive marketing campaign featuring the animated character Decimal Dan. In New Zealand, preparations for their own Decimal Day reached a peak as the government prepared the public for the same logistical hurdle. This change in currency removed a daily, tactile link to the British monetary system. At the same time, the region was reassessing its traditional alliances. Discarding pounds and shillings served to further sever the colonial legacy in favor of a distinct national identity. As political and economic structures changed, an influx of globalized media began to alter social norms from the ground up. The visual boundary between generations was clear. Traditional tailoring was being replaced by the sharp lines and shorter hemlines of mod fashion. Regional acts like the Easy Beats proved that local artists could compete directly against the British invasion dominating the airwaves. Young people began abandoning community ballrooms, favoring the youth-exclusive geography of suburban discotheques. This cultural separation was facilitated by the mass adoption of the portable transistor radio. Teenagers no longer relied on the single-family radio in the living room. They could consume international music in total privacy. This shift toward portable media allowed a new generation to build its own cultural vocabulary separate from the household establishment. While the transistor fragmented audiences into private spheres, the cinema marquee still commanded communal attention. The April 1966 box office was dominated by massive Hollywood epics like The Sound of Music and Dr. Zhivago. These grand spectacles provided a form of escapism, contrasting with the increasingly grim reports arriving from the Vietnam front. Simultaneously, a secondary tier of European art house films began to filter into independent local screenings. These alternative films exposed younger viewers to progressive ideas that challenged the narratives found in traditional studio releases. The cinematic landscape mirrored the era, offering comforts to the old guard while providing the youth with the tools to question the status quo. By the end of April 1966, the quiet aesthetic of the suburban street was occupied by these new symbols of change. The introduction of a new currency, the arrival of portable technology, and the shift in global alliances represented a structural change in how the region functioned. These were not isolated events. They were interlocking mechanisms that dismantled the previous social equilibrium. In 30 days, the region was forced to abandon its post-war certainty to navigate a more complex set of global and domestic pressures. The traditional national identity was permanently altered by the combined weight of these cultural and political shifts. April 1966 marked the point where the post-war era ended and the turbulence of the late 60s began. This was brought to you by Stalls or Circle. Thank you for listening.